You remember the sky breaking? It did not tear or shatter. It simply changed into something wrong. The familiar blue was gone, replaced by a crawling, sickly green, an oily film of light that coated everything. You stood on the Ferrocrete landing field. The air was cold, but you were sweating in your flight suit. Your helmet felt impossibly heavy. Every pilot around you stood the same, a silent army of statues waiting to crack. You looked up at the source of that foul light. The enemy armada had arrived. They were not a fleet. They were a plague upon the stars, a swarm of jagged obsidian ships. They hung in your atmosphere like predators. You had never seen so many. No one had. The simulations did not prepare you for this. The sheer scale was a violation. They blotted out the sun completely. Your world was plunged into a perpetual twilight. Their presence was a weight on your soul, a deep, crushing pressure of absolute defeat. Every screen on the planet showed the same image, the silent, waiting doom. News anchors had stopped talking. What was there left to say? Generals stared at tactical displays that were meaningless. A solid red block of enemy contacts. It was a joke, a cruel cosmic punchline. Your comms crackled with a single, system-wide order. All pilots to their fighters. Scramble, scramble. The word was a jolt of electricity. It broke the spell of despair for a moment. You ran with the others. Your boots echoed on the cold ground. 100 pilots. 1,000. It felt like so few. You climbed into the cockpit of your Starfire interceptor. The seat was cold leather against your back. You strapped yourself in. Your hands moved with practiced grace, flipping switches, powering up the engines. The familiar hum was a small comfort, a piece of the world as it was before the sky broke. Your wingman's voice came over the private channel. Well, look on the bright side. His voice was strained, trying for a calm he did not feel. We definitely get hazard pay for this one. You let out a sharp breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Gallows humor was the only kind you had left. The canopy slid shut. It sealed you in your tiny metal coffin. The world outside was muted. The green glow of the enemy ships pulsed. It was the only light you had. You looked at the picture taped to your console, a reminder of what you were fighting for, a memory of a sunlit beach, a smiling face. It felt like a dream from another life. The launch sequence began. The magnetic catapult would throw you into that horrible sky. You were a single arrow against a tidal wave, an act of defiance so small it was almost insane. But it was your duty. It was your final stand. You and the few thousand pilots like you. Humanity's last line of defense. You knew the math. You had seen the projections. Your fleet was outnumbered 100 to 1. Their ships were larger. Their weapons were stronger. This was not a battle. This was an execution. Yet you held the controls. Your knuckles were white. You would fly. You would fight. You would die. But you would not die alone. You would take some of them with you. That was the promise you made to yourself. The promise every pilot made. You would make them pay for your sky. You would make them bleed for your world. The catapult fired. You were thrown forward with crushing force. The green abyss rushed to meet you. This was the final hour. All hope was a fading ember. You saw it in the BattleNet data streams. Friendly call signs vanishing one by one. Little lights winking out of existence. Each one a friend, a comrade, a life extinguished in a silent flash of light. The enemy was a methodical, grinding machine. They did not rush. They did not make mistakes. They simply advanced. You dodged and weaved through a storm of plasma fire. Your ship screamed under the strain. Alarms blared in a constant, frantic chorus. You fired back. Your cannon spat coherent light into the void. You saw a few of their smaller drones rupture. Tiny victories in a war that was already lost. They were so insignificant, like swatting insects in a hurricane. Then the message came. It cut through all channels. A voice you recognized. High Command. General Eva Rostova. Her voice was calm, impossibly calm. It was a rock in the swirling chaos. All remaining assets, she began. Disengage and retreat to defensive perimeter Gamma. Retreat? You gritted your teeth. There was nowhere left to run. Perimeter Gamma was a line on a map, a final circle drawn around your homeworld, a last stand for the ground forces. It was an admission of defeat. Your heart sank. The last flicker of defiance guttered out, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. This was the end. But the general was not finished. Her voice took on a new tone, something that was not in any military manual. It was a thread of pure, desperate faith. Hold your positions at the perimeter. She paused. You could hear the fate of a species in that silence. A new asset is being deployed. A new asset? What could it possibly be? You had thrown everything you had at them. Every ship, every weapon, every secret project was already flying, or it was already wreckage. A bitter laugh escaped your lips. Was this it? Some final, pathetic bluff to keep morale from shattering completely? Another pilot voiced your thoughts. Command, what asset? His voice was sharp with disbelief. We have nothing left that can touch them. The general's reply was swift, and it changed everything. Project Colossus is active. The words hung in the void. Project Colossus. A myth. A ghost story told in hushed tones by engineers. A theoretical weapon system so vast, so expensive. It was deemed impossible to build. A flight of fancy from a bygone era of optimism. It was the government's biggest, most embarrassing secret. A money pit that produced nothing. You had heard the jokes. What's bigger than a moon and just as useless? Project Colossus. It was a symbol of hubris, not hope. Yet General Rostova spoke the name like a prayer. You wanted to dismiss it. To call it a lie meant to make you die with a smile. But her certainty was infectious. You pulled your fighter into a tight arc. You raced toward the designated perimeter. Other surviving pilots did the same. A scattered, battered flock seeking a shepherd. You did not know what to believe. But it was better than the cold truth of oblivion. It was a desperate gamble. And right now, that was all you had. You reached the coordinates for perimeter Gamma. Just a patch of empty space between your world and the enemy. You turned your ship to face the approaching horde. You and a few hundred other survivors. A thin, fragile line. You watched the enemy advance. Uncaring, unstoppable. You waited for a miracle. Or you waited for the end. The ground began to shake. It was not the familiar rumble of an earthquake. This was deeper, more profound. A vibration that resonated in your very bones. On the surface of your world, mountains trembled. Cities shook on their foundations. The oceans themselves seemed to recoil, as if something immense was stirring in the planet's heart. You watched from your cockpit in orbit. Your sensors tried to make sense of the planetary disturbance. They failed. The readings were off the charts. Impossible numbers that screamed of planetary fracture, of a world tearing itself apart from the inside. For a terrifying moment, you thought the enemy had deployed a new weapon, a planet killer. But the energy signature was wrong. It was not alien. It was human. The signal was broadcast on all channels, encrypted, ancient. It was the activation code for the Ghost, for Project Colossus. The great secret was no longer a secret. It was a seismic event. The desperate prayer was being answered. A chasm opened in the planet's crust, a wound in the earth dozens of miles long. It split a continent. It boiled away a sea. From this fiery canyon, something rose. It was not a ship. It was a landmass, a piece of the world itself taking to the sky. It was so large your mind struggled to accept it. Rock and magma fell away from its form, like a chick shedding its shell, revealing the structure beneath. It was metal, a dark, impossibly ancient alloy that drank the light. It was a titan, a sleeping giant that had been hidden, not in a hangar, but beneath the very ground you walked on. Its awakening was a slow, majestic process. You felt the awe ripple through the fleet. The stunned silence on the comms was absolute. This was the asset. This was the desperate gamble. It was not a ship. It was a mobile fortress, a battle station the size of a small moon. The jokes died on your lips. The skepticism evaporated. This was no money pit. This was the single greatest undertaking in human history. A project so vast, so ambitious. It had been built in total secrecy over generations, buried deep within the planet, waiting for the darkest hour, waiting for this exact moment. You could only stare. The Titan rose from its cradle of fire and rock. It cleared the upper atmosphere. The ground shuddered one last time, as if sighing in relief. The Colossus had been born. It shed the last of its terrestrial shell. Its true form was revealed, a weapon of unimaginable scale. It was a monument to defiance, a testament to a species that would move worlds to survive. Your fear did not vanish, but it was joined by something else, something fierce and wild, a surge of pride that burned away the cold despair. You were human, and this was what your people could do. The sleeping giant was awake, and it was magnificent. The ascent was a silent spectacle, a moment frozen in time. The Colossus climbed. It moved with a grace that defied its impossible size. It rose through the upper atmosphere, a man-made mountain casting a shadow over a continent. It was a new moon in your sky, a dark omen for your enemies, a symbol of terrible hope for you. From your vantage point in space, it was breathtaking. It eclipsed the very world it had risen from. The sun, which had been hidden by the enemy fleet, was now hidden by your champion. A double darkness. But this new shadow felt different. It felt like shelter. The enemy armada watched. You could almost feel their confusion across the void. Their relentless advance slowed. Then it stopped. For the first time since their arrival, their perfect formation wavered. They had calculated every variable, accounted for every ship in your arsenal. They had not accounted for this. Their star science had failed them. You imagined the alien commander on his bridge, staring at a view screen that showed an impossibility, a weapon that should not exist, a machine larger than some of their own home worlds. Perhaps for the first time, the enemy, the Cathar, felt a flicker of doubt. The cold certainty of their victory was shaken. The Colossus continued its ascent. It moved into low orbit, settling into a geostationary position. It placed itself between your world and the Cathar fleet, a shield of unimaginable proportions. Its dark hull was pitted and scarred, not from battle, but from millennia of slumber within the planet's core. It looked ancient, primeval, like a relic from a forgotten age of gods. The comms channels were still silent. No one knew what to say. You were all children staring up at a legend made real. You felt an overwhelming urge to cheer, but the sound was caught in your throat. This was too sacred for noise. Your wingman's voice was a whisper. They built it inside the planet. He said it with a sense of wonder that bordered on religious fear. They hid a giant inside our world. It was a truth so profound, it bordered on madness. Your leaders had not built a ship. They had converted a portion of a planet into one. The sheer audacity was staggering. The resources, the secrecy, the generations of dedication. It was a plan so long, so patient. It was almost inhuman. It was a legacy of survival passed down through the ages. A secret kept not just from your enemies, but from your own people. It had to be this way. Any hint of its existence would have made your world a primary target, long before you were ready. So it slept. It waited. And now it had risen. A shadow blotting out the sun. A promise kept by your ancestors. The enemy watched in stunned silence. And for the first time, you felt they were the ones who were afraid. The enemy's shock did not last long. They were a warrior race. Their confusion quickly turned to aggression. They saw the Colossus not as an impossible threat, but as a massive target, a challenge to their dominance. The Cathar fleet began to move again. Their smaller ships broke formation, swarming toward the silent Titan. Scout wings and interceptor drones converged on its hull. Thousands of them, a cloud of angry, buzzing insects. They looked like dust motes against the sheer scale of the Colossus. You watched from your perimeter position. Your orders were to hold, to observe, to let the giant fight its own battle. The first volley of enemy fire struck the Colossus. Bright lances of energy. Kinetic projectiles moving at near light speed. They impacted against the dark metal. And they did nothing. The energy dissipated across the hull like ripples in a pond. The projectiles flattened and fell away like harmless rain. You saw no shields flicker to life. No defensive systems activate. The hull itself simply absorbed the punishment. It was an armor so dense, so strong. It treated their weapons as trivial annoyances. The Colossus did not even seem to notice. It hung in the void, silent, immovable, patient. The swarm of Cathar fighters descended. They strafed the surface of the giant, trying to find a weakness, a seam in the armor, a vulnerable sensor node. They flew across vast plains of metal, down canyons that were miles deep, trenches that could swallow 100 of your own capital ships. It was a new form of geography, a world of metal with its own mountains and valleys, and the enemy scouts were lost in it. Their attacks were less than flea bites. The Colossus ignored their futile efforts. It remained focused on the main Cathar fleet. It knew where the real threat was. You felt a strange sense of pity for the enemy pilots. They were brave, following their orders, flying into the shadow of a god. They were firing everything they had. And their fury meant nothing. They were raging against a mountain, shouting at a storm. Their actions were completely, utterly irrelevant. One of your fellow pilots chuckled over the comms. It was a raw, incredulous sound. It's not even turning on its point defense. He sounded giddy. It doesn't need to. He was right. The giant did not waste energy on such minor threats. It was saving its strength for the real fight. The Colossus began to glow, not from enemy fire, but from within. Thin lines of golden light traced patterns across its surface. A network of conduits waking up. Power was being routed. Systems were coming online. The giant was no longer just a shield. It was preparing to strike back. A section of the forward prow began to shift. Immense plates of armor slid apart, revealing a circular aperture, an opening so vast it could have been a crater. It was dark, a perfect circle of blackness. But deep within that darkness, a light began to form. A terrible, wonderful light. First contact was over. The Colossus had been tested, and it had been found wanting for nothing. Now it was its turn to speak. The light inside the weapon housing grew. It started as a tiny spark, a pinprick of gold in the immense darkness. Then it swelled, expanding with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was the color of a star's heart, a furious, incandescent yellow that pulsed with contained power. The Colossus was charging its primary weapon. You watched, mesmerized by the spectacle. Your sensors screamed warnings about the energy readings. They were values that had no business existing. The power of a supernova being focused into a single point. All the futile attacks from the Cathar scouts faded into insignificance. This was the real first contact. The golden light grew brighter and brighter. It washed out the sickly green of the enemy armada. It cast long, sharp shadows across the hull of the Colossus. It illuminated your own small fighter, bathing your cockpit in a warm, terrifying glow. You felt the energy even from miles away, a static charge in the air, a vibration in the very fabric of space. The Cathar fleet seemed to realize its mistake. Their main dreadnoughts began to fire. Concentrating their power on the charging weapon, they hoped to disrupt it, to destroy it before it could unleash its fury. Heavy beams of purple energy crossed the void. They hammered the area around the cannon aperture. The armored plates of the Colossus glowed red under the assault. But they held. They did not buckle. They did not break. The giant was absorbing the firepower of a dozen capital ships, and it continued its task without faltering. The golden light reached its peak intensity. It was too bright to look at directly. A miniature sun had been born in the void. Then it fired. There was no sound, only a sudden, violent release. A beam of pure sunfire energy erupted from the Colossus. It was not a laser. It was not a plasma bolt. It was a torrent of raw, star-born power, a solid pillar of light that crossed the distance to the enemy fleet in an instant. It did not strike a single ship. It struck the heart of their formation, their vanguard, a dense cluster of cruisers and destroyers that led the charge. The beam hit them, and they vanished. Not exploded. Vanished. The energy was so immense it simply unmade them, wiping them from existence atom by atom. The beam held for 3 terrifying seconds. It carved a perfect line through the Cathar formation, a corridor of absolute destruction. Where a moment before there had been dozens of warships, now there was only empty space and fading motes of incandescent dust. The heart of their vanguard had been torn out. The cannon fell silent. The golden light faded. The immense aperture on the Colossus was once again a circle of perfect black. The Titan had spoken its first word, and that word was doom. A profound silence fell over the battlefield. The surviving Cathar ships drifted, their formation shattered, their confidence broken. You stared at the empty space where their fleet had been. You tried to comprehend what you had just witnessed. A single weapon, a single shot, and it had erased a significant portion of the enemy fleet. This was not a weapon of war. It was a tool of gods. A cheer finally broke over the comms, a single ragged voice at first, then another and another. Soon it was a roar, a wave of pure, unadulterated triumph. You found your own voice joining in. The fear was gone. The despair was a distant memory. The Sunfire cannon had not just destroyed their ships. It had reignited the fire in your soul. Your role in this battle had changed. You were no longer a desperate defender, a final, futile line of defense. You were an escort, a guard of honor for the metal behemoth that had saved you. You flew your fighter alongside its massive frame, a tiny spark of silver next to a mountain of dark iron. The Colossus had become your fortress. Its hull was a shield not just for your world, but for your spirit. Its presence reshaped the battlefield. It redefined the very nature of the war. You were no longer the prey. You were part of the hunt. And you flew with a pride you had never known. The surviving Cathar vanguard was in disarray. Their command structure for that sector was gone, wiped out by the Sunfire cannon. The ships that remained were scattered. Their movements were erratic. Some turned to flee, others fired wildly, their shots going wide. Panic was a contagion, and the Colossus was the source. You and the other pilots of the Starfire wings were given a new order. Not to retreat, not to hold, but to attack, engage, and destroy all remaining vanguard elements. General? Rostova's voice was hard as steel. Clear a path for the Colossus, a wolf pack unleashed. That is what you were. You pushed your throttle forward. Your squadron fell into a perfect attack formation. You were a flock of predators descending on a wounded animal. You swept through the scattered enemy ships. Your lasers and missiles struck with renewed accuracy. Your targets were confused, disorganized. They were easy prey. Before, every engagement was a desperate struggle for survival. Now, it was a hunt. You flew with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. You dodged their return fire with ease. Your ship felt faster, more responsive, fueled by the sheer adrenaline of victory. It was probably just your imagination, but it felt real. The Colossus moved forward, a slow, unstoppable advance. It did not need to fire its main cannon again. Its sheer presence was a weapon. The enemy ships gave way before it. They scrambled to get out of its path. It was a whale moving through a school of terrified fish. Its massive frame provided cover for your attacks. You could dive behind a massive spar of armor, evade a volley of plasma, then emerge on the other side to strike again. You were a part of its ecosystem, a remora fish clinging to the side of a great shark, a thought that should have been humbling, but it felt glorious. Your wingman flew beside you. "I think I need a bigger call sign now," he joked. His voice was light, carefree. "Something that reflects my new status as friend of the big guy." You laughed, a real, genuine laugh this time. The first one in what felt like an eternity. The humor was back, because hope was back. The Cathar were not cowards. Their main fleet, the larger dreadnoughts and carriers, began to reform. They saw the Colossus not as an invincible god, but as a singular, high-value target. They understood the threat now, and they were preparing a coordinated response. The real battle was about to begin, but for these few moments, you savored the reversal of fortune. You were no longer watching your friends die. You were watching the enemy break. You were no longer fighting for scraps of survival. You were fighting for total victory, all because of the giant at your side. The sky was still dark, but it was your darkness now. It was the shadow of your champion, your fortress in the void. It was a shield for all of humanity, and you were its sword. The enemy dreadnoughts were terrifying. Each one was a city killer, a mobile fortress bristling with world-ending weapons. You had seen what a single one could do to a colony, glassing continents with casual, indifferent firepower. Now, dozens of them were turning their attention to the Colossus, a council of demons gathering to slay a god. They unleashed their torpedoes, not the small tactical missiles used against fighters, These were apocalypse torpedoes. Each one carried a payload capable of cracking a planet's crust. They moved through the void like hungry sharks, streaks of deadly light converging on a single point. The Colossus. You watched the wave of destruction approach. A part of your mind screamed in terror. Nothing could survive that. Nothing. It was enough firepower to shatter a solar system. The fragile hope that had bloomed in your chest withered. This was it. The giant had awakened only to be slain. The Colossus did not try to evade. It did not fire its point defense systems. It simply met the storm head-on. The first torpedo struck its prow. The warhead detonated, a silent, blossoming flower of pure, destructive energy. The light was blinding. You threw up your ship's blast shields, but you could still feel the force of it. A shockwave in space-time that rattled your fighter to its core. Then another torpedo hit, and another, and another. A rolling, thundering barrage of apocalyptic fire. The entire forward section of the Colossus was engulfed in a continuous, searing inferno. It was like watching a star go nova. The combined energy release was beyond anything you had ever witnessed. Your heart broke. It was a beautiful, heroic effort. But it was over. You had dared to hope, and the universe had punished you for it. You waited for the explosions to fade. You expected to see nothing but shattered wreckage. A field of debris where the great Titan once stood. The fire subsided. The blinding light dimmed. You lowered your blast shields. You looked, and you could not believe your eyes. The Colossus was still there. It was scarred. The point of impact on its prow glowed with intense heat. Molten armor dripped like lava from a volcano. But the giant was intact. It had taken the full, concentrated power of the Cathar's deadliest weapons, and it was still moving forward. It had shrugged off their apocalyptic fire as if it were a minor inconvenience. The molten armor began to cool, hardening back into a solid shell of dark metal. The giant was healing itself. A wave of disbelief washed over the comms. It was a collective gasp from 1,000 pilots. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "It just ate them." The Cathar had thrown their best punch, their world-ending, God-killing blow. And the Colossus had barely flinched. This was no longer a battle. It was a confrontation between two different levels of existence. You were witnessing a new kind of power, a technology so advanced it bordered on magic. The Cathar were masters of star science, but the builders of the Colossus, they were masters of reality itself. Your wingman's voice was filled with a new kind of respect, awe mixed with a healthy dose of fear. "Okay, I'm officially terrified of the people who built that thing." He was right. You were fighting alongside a miracle, but you had to wonder about the minds that had conceived it. What kind of people build a god and hide it in a planet? The Colossus continued its relentless advance. The Cathar dreadnoughts fired again, but their second volley was weaker, more desperate. They knew it was useless. But what else could they do? It was the fury of a child punching a mountain. Their ultimate power had been proven insufficient. Their confidence was shattered, and now their doom was certain. The giant did not slow. It did not stop. It moved through the enemy formation like a force of nature. It was an asteroid that would not be diverted, a glacier that would not be stopped. The Cathar ships, once so proud and menacing, were now just obstacles in its path. Brittle and insignificant, they were too close to maneuver away. The Colossus was upon them before they could retreat. A Cathar cruiser, a vessel miles long, found itself directly in the Titan's way. It fired its engines in a desperate, futile attempt to escape. It was too slow. The prow of the Colossus, still glowing with residual heat, connected with the cruiser. There was no explosion, no dramatic burst of energy. The cruiser simply came apart. The ancient, hyper-dense armor of the giant sliced through the smaller ship's hull as if it were paper. Metal screamed and twisted. The cruiser shattered against the armored prow like glass. It was a demonstration of pure, kinetic power. The Colossus did not need to fire its weapons. Its body was a weapon. Its unstoppable momentum was enough to destroy anything it touched. You watched in grim satisfaction as the wreckage of the cruiser tumbled past. A broken toy discarded by an uncaring Titan. Another Cathar destroyer tried to flank the Colossus, to get behind it and attack its engines. The giant seemed to anticipate the move. A section of its hull plating shifted. A dozen smaller weapon emplacements were revealed. Not the Sunfire cannon. These were rapid-fire plasma turrets. They spat a furious volley of blue energy. The plasma bolts tore into the destroyer, ripping through its shields and armor. The ship's reactor went critical. It erupted in a silent, brilliant flash of light. Another enemy vessel turned into scrap metal. The Colossus was a complete warfighting system, a fortress that could defend itself from all angles. Your squadron continued its work, mopping up the smaller, fleeing ships, herding them into the path of the giant. You were the sheepdogs, and the Colossus was the patient, methodical wolf. The enemy was caught between you, harried by your fighters, crushed by the Titan. Their formation was not just broken, it was being consumed. You flew past a vast canyon on the Colossus's surface. You realized it was not a canyon. It was a scar, the mark left by the first Apocalypse torpedo. It was already cooling, the molten metal hardening into a new, rugged landscape. The giant wore its wounds as trophies. The dark humor returned to the comms. "Someone owes the maintenance crew a drink," a pilot quipped. "That's going to take a lot of paint to buff out." The laughter was infectious, a release of tension, a celebration of your impossible survival, a salute to your unstoppable champion. The Cathar fleet was no longer a fleet. It was a debris field with survivors. Their cohesion was gone. Their will to fight was evaporating. But one ship held its ground. One vessel did not run. It was the largest of them all, the enemy flagship. From the heart of the shattered Cathar fleet, it emerged. The alien Supreme Commander's personal warship was a beast of a vessel, twice the size of any other dreadnought. Its hull was a shifting, crystalline material. Unlike the jagged, dark metal of the other ships, it shimmered with an internal, malevolent light. This was their greatest warship, the pinnacle of their technology, the symbol of their empire's might. And it was moving to intercept the Colossus. A direct challenge. The alien commander, whose name you did not know, refused to retreat. He was making his last stand, an act of defiant pride. He ordered a direct assault. A final, desperate charge against the giant that had ruined him. All remaining Cathar warships that were still loyal, still functional, rallied to their flagship, a small but determined core of resistance. They formed a protective spearhead around their leader. You watched the two giants prepare to meet. The Colossus, a dark, brutalist mountain of ancient metal. The Cathar flagship, a sleek, crystalline predator of lethal beauty. It was a battle of philosophies, the grim, patient determination of your people, against the arrogant, aggressive pride of the enemy. Your own orders came through. All fighter wings form a defensive screen around the Colossus. General, Rostova's voice was tense. Do not let their support craft interfere. This is a duel between titans. You pulled your squadron back, forming a cordon around your champion. Your job was to keep the lesser foes at bay, to ensure a fair fight, if such a thing was possible in this war. The enemy flagship powered its weapons. Beams of energy, far more powerful than any you had seen before, began to form. The crystalline hull seemed to amplify the power, focusing it into lances of pure, white-hot fury. This was a ship designed not just to fight fleets, but to kill things like the Colossus. The Supreme Commander was not a fool. He had seen the failure of the Apocalypse torpedoes. He knew blunt force would not work. So he was trying a different approach. He was focusing all his ship's power into a single, precise, armor-piercing beam. A surgeon's scalpel against a warrior's shield. The Colossus responded in kind. The Sunfire cannon began to charge once more. The deep, circular aperture glowed with that familiar, terrifying golden light. The miniature sun was being reborn. It grew in intensity, matching the rising power of the enemy flagship. You held your breath. The space between the two giants crackled with energy. The void itself seemed to strain under the immense power being gathered. This was it. The duel that would decide the war. The fate of your world hung on this single, cataclysmic exchange. A duel of giants was about to begin.